Welcome back to Counterpoints. I'm Ryan Grimm here with Emily Jashinsky. It's my favorite time of the year, the show after an election night when the anti-abortion crowd just gets completely trounced.
Every
just
year.
To come out here and do a little victory lap. And weed, also weed.
We did well last night.
Public power got rinsed in Maine. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
So it was not complete wins across the board on ballot measures, but for the most part, pretty triumphant night for the center left, let's say.
Yeah, and some big results we're going to go through right now. And Ryan was also keyed in on some pretty interesting races that you may not have heard about from a lot of the, big coverage. They were sort of down ballot races or local races that are worth paying attention to. We're also going to do some updates, of course, on Israel. Rashida Tlaib was formally censured by the House of Representatives last night. We're going to get into all of that. We're going to get into the raging debate over tying Ukraine funding to Israel that took place in the Senate yesterday and is ongoing. And then, of course, we're going to dive into the 2024 race. Sagar caught some numbers in the New York Times poll that everyone was talking about this week that nobody was talking about. Turns out there was something in the poll pretty interesting that had a pretty interesting implications for RFK Jr.'s run. We're also, lest you think there's too much news happening, but wait, there's more. There's a Republican debate tonight, so we'll do a little preview of that.
Republican vice presidential debate at best?
At best.
Is that what
Republican Secretary of State debate, maybe.
Yeah, like maybe vice president. There might be a vice president on that stage, but there's no guarantee.
No, not at all.
All right, so let's start with Ohio.
Let's start with Ohio.
So two important measures were on the ballot there. One, abortion, and we can put this first element up here. The second one being marijuana. And so back in the summer, as you guys remember, there was an effort by Republicans to change the way that the Constitution is amended to put the threshold at 60%. So you would need a 60% vote to change the amendment. That was happening as support for abortion rights was polling in the high 50s.
Right.
And everybody thought, oh, they're trying to keep this from passing. If they had succeeded, they failed. If they had succeeded, this would have failed. Abortion would have failed because currently it's just under 57% support. So an overwhelming vote on, and we can put up weed too. Weed actually edged out the abortion rights. So you did have, a non-trivial number of people go into the ballot box and say, yes, I support legal weed. No, I do not support abortion rights.
But a really similar margin, which is interesting as well.
It's maybe thousands of people at most around the entire state. And so both of those are going to become law. You're going to have legalized and regulated marijuana sales opening up in Ohio. But also the big win there is question one.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So now you've got abortion rights enshrined into the Constitution in Ohio. This comes after Montana, Kentucky, obviously California, Vermont, not that exciting, Michigan. So Kansas, everywhere that abortion rights have been on the ballot, abortion rights have won. So what's been the response? I've seen a couple of different responses. I'm curious what you're seeing from the conservative wing, which, do they want to give up on this and say, like, this is a huge loser for us? Or like the kind of Republican Senate president, are they saying, let's push ahead and see if we can get this on the ballot again next year?
Well, they know they can't give up on it because Democrats now see this as such an important electoral issue because it drives turnout and it brings independent leaners over to Dems. And on the principal issue for Democrats, it accomplishes, again, like enshrining a right to abortion. The wording in this became somewhat of an issue. Issue one, the wording of it opened up the door for Republicans to come in and say, potentially this is going to lead to all kinds of issues with same-sex bathrooms, different-sex bathrooms, co-ed bathrooms.
Right, they tried to move away from abortion and over to other culture stuff.
And I think there was a real problem with the wording to the point where even the Toledo Blade said, listen, we support abortion rights, but the wording here is overly broad. This is an overly broad power. Obviously, that didn't make a difference. 57 to 43 is roughly the margin in both the weed and abortion races, but
and
Republicans...
This probably comes from Democratic squeamishness about saying the word abortion. Is that right?
It might.
Or do you think it actually is a broader agenda?
The wording,
smuggled through?
Yeah, the wording is pretty interesting, but Democrats were like leaning into this every step of the way. Not just, I shouldn't just say Democrats, because obviously this is the broader left was fighting this really hard. And Republicans, this is what I've heard a lot on the pro-life side, conservatives were wildly outspent on issue 1. So it's about 24.4 million to about 16.3 million. And pro-life groups have a really hard time, anti-abortion groups have a very hard time getting money into these races. So it might be easier to fundraise for just a generic Republican race somewhere like Ohio than it is to get money for an anti-abortion initiative. And that's why that ballot measure that we covered back in August was so important, because all of the pro-life groups, I've talked to a bunch of them over the last few months, saw the writing on the wall. They knew that if they could get to that 60% threshold somewhere in Ohio, there's basically no way that this would pass. It did come close, but they knew that if they could, say you need 60% to change the Constitution, that it would be safe from their perspective. Now, that 57% number, I pretty much guarantee all along they knew it was going to be 55, 57, somewhere like that, because it's an almost impossible issue for Republicans, even in places like Ohio and Kansas. And next year, Arizona, Florida, Nevada, Colorado, South Dakota are looking to get similar ballot initiatives together. So Republicans had Michigan, they had other Kansas, Montana, as you mentioned, all of that told them that this was going to happen. They just couldn't get donors interested, and they still haven't figured out the messaging.
And so you have Republican Senate President, who I just referenced, Matt Huffman. He said in his statement last night, "This isn't the end. It is really just the beginning of a revolving door of ballot campaigns to repeal or replace issue 1." So that's the Senate President saying that they're going to continue to try to put this on the ballot. But help me understand that. They know that they're going to lose.
Yeah.
Like you said, they're going to be outspent because a lot of wealthy Democrats are strongly for abortion rights.
Right.
And they don't, I think a lot of wealthy Democrats give to Democrats because they kind of align with their politics, but they don't really like that Democrats might raise their taxes a little bit, might mess with the carried interest loophole, might do some regulation around private equity, which is where all their money's coming from. But when it comes to funding abortion measures, they're fine with that. Like no moral confliction whatsoever. Like this it feels good to them. It's the right thing to do. Many of them have experience with it. It's deeply personal to them. And so there's always going to be money for these ballot measures. The public is wildly on Democrats' side on this question. It brings people to the polls and hurts Republicans, and we'll talk about how it hurt Republicans across the board in the rest of these elections today. So then why would you have somebody like Huffman say, we're going to just keep doing this?
And by the way, they said something
Not
similar.
that I'm against him doing it. Like, go ahead, keep banging your head against the wall. But
yeah, so for the last couple of years, especially since Dobbs passed and Roe fell, Republicans, conservatives, anti-abortion people have said it's time to, on the messaging level, confront this head on. That's where you saw Ron DeSantis sign the heartbeat bill, and other people have signed, Texas had a heartbeat bill, saying, all right, so Roe is gone. And in the vacuum that creates, so that you can't just sort of punt and say, I support, the end of Roe, you need to have a clear stance that is honest, and it needs to confront the issue boldly, and you can't just run away from it. And so that's what a lot of these groups have been counseling candidates to do. That's where Lindsey Graham and the Susan B. Anthony list worked on that 15-week measure on the Senate side to give Republicans something to talk about. Glenn Youngkin was pretty clear that he said, if I'm elected, I'm going to limit abortion rights. And that didn't do so well in Virginia, and there were a lot of abortion ads on it. Let me read a quote from Lila Rose. This was part of her statement. She's from Live Action, a big anti-abortion group. Lila Rose said, the pro-life movement must adapt to win. We have to throw out the old playbook and dive headfirst into a strategy that can win the hearts and minds of the American people and translate into electoral victory. So just what you're getting from that is increasing acknowledgement that the hearts and minds of the American people are not with pro-life, anti-abortion people like myself on this question. It is wildly unpopular with the American people, and it's insane for conservatives over and over again to delude themselves into thinking that's not true.
Does she have a strategy? Because I agree with her that from her perspective, they should stop with a strategy that loses and adopt a strategy that wins.
Yeah.
But what is that? Do they have
No, it reminds me actually of repeal and replace. Because Lila Rose knows exactly what she supports on the question of abortion. what that looks like in states like Ohio, translating into how candidates talk about this, what policy initiatives might be on the ballot or, be fought from getting on the ballot is a completely different question. People felt really good about coalescing around that 15-week bill, although there was some internal grumbling among the right flank in sort of conservative circles about whether or not that was appropriate, because it's still 15 weeks and the majority of abortions are happening before that. So there's just, it is similar to repeal and replace in the extent that it's like nobody quite knows where the sweet spot is, and nobody can decide on a consensus position because there's such a intensity of thought on one side about where those guardrails should be, and such an intensity. There was, I thought, just quickly, a really bad headline I saw last night in the Messenger that said Republicans were, they said something like Republicans were overjoyed when Roe v. Wade fell, and now it's become one of their biggest electoral problems. I'm paraphrasing it, but something like that. Republicans were not overjoyed when Roe v. Wade fell.
Elite Republicans were like, wait a minute, what are you doing?
They were, and we were on the air when it, like literally when it happened, and I remember saying something to the extent of like, the RNC is freaking out right now, like quaking in their boots, and someone who would have knowledge of that came up to me afterwards and was like, I was listening when you said that. I was there, basically, and it was 100% accurate. So Republican voters may have been overjoyed by the fall of Roe. Republicans here were terrified.
Dog overjoyed, he has caught car.
Yeah.
So we'll go to Virginia in a second, but let's talk about Kentucky for a second, put up this next one. So Andy Beshear, popular Democratic governor in Kentucky who won a real squeaker in 2019, kind of relatively smoked Daniel Cameron last night, a 5-point victory in a race that was expected to be within a point or so. Daniel Cameron, longtime Mitch McConnell protege. This is somebody who was basically, I think since he was an intern, pretty much been destined for this gubernatorial race, and kind of guided to it by Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell pushed him over the finish line to be Attorney General, and everyone in Kentucky has just been waiting for this guy's turn at governor. And the question wasn't when he was going to, if he was going to be governor, just when.
Right.
But Andy Beshear told him not yet. And so what role do you think abortion played in that? And what role do you think Andy Beshear, just kind of being a good and popular governor, particularly among Eastern Kentucky folks, made the difference? Like, what's your read there?
Well, and I'm curious for your sense of how Beshear is as a politician, as a red state Southern Democrat, because that's a really interesting position to be in. My big takeaway, the headline that we ran at the Federalist right away was Mitch McConnell protege gets knocked down. As you said, Sean Davis over at the Federalist tweeted right away, given that Mitch McConnell is far and away the most unpopular national political figure in the entire country, minus 39 in net favorability according to Real Clear's average. It's not surprising that McConnell ties have turned into a massive political liability in Kentucky. And he tweeted pictures of all these headlines tying Daniel Cameron to Mitch McConnell. I actually think there's something to that because Mitch McConnell is probably more popular in his own state than he is on a national level. When people pay attention to national media, he's a familiar figure. I think that partially helped Beshear. There's an incumbent advantage built into all of that, even in a red state. He handled some storms in a way that a lot of people felt was pretty good and respectable and earned him some goodwill. But I mean, I don't know. When I look at that, I think, how can Mitch McConnell, who's one of the most powerful people in the country, handpick this guy and lose in his own state? It basically confirms all of the conservative arguments about Mitch McConnell's political instincts actually being terrible.
And Beshear benefited from being in office during the pandemic, and he was widely kind of heralded across. I mean, obviously you had a subset of people who, hated the way that the government handled COVID across the board, but overwhelmingly his approval rating shot through the roof, just the way that like Cuomo's did in New York and Hogan and Republican governors. Every governor who was in office during COVID saw a huge boost in their approval rating because people just kind of felt like they were so scared they wanted to vest some kind of authority in authority figures. And I think for a lot of people on the right and the kind of the skeptical left around there, that's difficult to kind of even believe because it's so counter to the way that so many other millions of people experienced the pandemic, where they turned away from authority.
Yes.
It created a crisis of authority and legitimacy. But that's the minority. Like the normies were like, Bashir, Andy has handled this just absolutely incredibly. And then you made a good point about the flooding. If you remember those Eastern Kentucky floods a couple of years ago, just absolutely devastated the region. We could put up this next element here from Sahil Kapoor. He was widely credited as handling the floods with the same level of kind of leadership that people credited him with handling the response to the pandemic.
I mean, look at that map.
He's on TV every night. He's assuring people, like the way that Bill Clinton in the 90s was like the comforter in chief. Like Bashir kind of had that characteristic. So look, right. So this is Trump and Biden on one side. And if you're listening on the podcast, it's an image of basically a sea of red, except for Louisville and Lexington and Frankfurt, when it was Trump versus Biden. Now, in this election, you see Eastern Kentucky like thoroughly blue, like the Appalachian area, and particularly in these counties that were hardest hit by the flood, shows that if you deliver for people, you show leadership, you help a community pick itself up, you're going to be rewarded.
You win goodwill beyond partisan, and actually that's beyond partisan boundaries. And that's something Aaron Blake actually pointed out yesterday that I think also gets to the McConnell question. He said the best performing statewide GOP candidate in Kentucky was Secretary of State Michael Adams, who strongly rejected stolen election talk and turned aside a primary challenge. He's at 61%. The Republican AG candidate was at 58%. So there's something about Cameron and Bashir. Bashir was able to, I think, capitalize on that built-in goodwill, as you just mentioned. You look at the map, Eastern Kentucky, pretty favorable to Bashir, especially comparable to Trump. But that's also where people on the Trump side are going to come in and say, without Trump on the ticket and with all of these candidates running away from Trump, contra Aaron Blake, you don't get the energy that you need to match Democratic turnout operations, mail-in ballot operations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to be the argument. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying, I think there's probably some evidence of it. Also, it's really easy, though, for that to become a cope, because it's just reactions to the Trump Republican Party are all over the map, depending on where you are, literally all over the map. So it's easy to fall into that line of thinking and just blaming elite establishment Republicans, which is true. They deserve a whole lot of blame. And I think the Daniel Cameron results are part of that. But it's not the whole story.
And Republicans are in a tricky spot, because the only thing worse for Republicans than having Trump on the ballot seems to be not having Trump on the ballot.
Right, no, really, that's true.
What do they have left? And before we go to Virginia, real quickly, the other thing that people in Kentucky really seem to like about Bashir is job increases. Like, he brought a lot of jobs to the state, both kind of relocating from elsewhere, and that was a pandemic effect as well, but also being open and kind of attractive, and not getting yourself caught up in like culture war stuff where you're getting boycotted by places probably helped as well. So all of those things combined to get lots and lots of people who support Trump to vote for Andy Bashir, who instantly becomes somebody that is going to be talked about as a presidential candidate.
Although good luck to him courting the left flank.
The left is like just beaten down. I think it's just like whatever at this point.
Well, speaking of which, we actually have some results on that to go through too.
Oh, yes, we do. We'll get to those in a second. Let's do Virginia first.
Let's do Virginia.
All right. So let's throw up Virginia here. So Virginia Democrats kept control of the Senate, and you can put up the next one here. They also flipped the House of Delegates.
It's an absolute rout for Republicans who put all of their hopes in Glenn Youngkin fundraising for 2 years, bringing in some big money to Virginia and saying, we are going to...
And we're going to get a trifecta. We're going to make me a presidential candidate. We're going to restrict abortion rights. And that's where the record stopped. It's like, wait a minute, you're going to do what in Virginia?
Right.
And it's how much of it was just Virginia's a more Democratic state than it is a Republican state, and how much of it do you think came down to the question of abortion rights? And then we're going to get to Susanna Gibson as this key race. This is the Cam lady who might win. We'll see.
Yeah.
It's going to be very close.
Right. So, I think, yes, of course, abortion became a big part of this, and Glenn Youngkin was using part of a strategy that the anti-abortion movement and pro-life people, including myself, by the way, think is better, which is being sort of using, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, bold colors, not pale pastels. They'll be wishy-washy on it because then you're allowing Democrats to define you on the issue, to make voters see you as dishonest. If your position is less popular and you're honest about it, you'll probably get rewarded more so than if your position is unpopular and you look to everybody like you're lying about it. And it did not work out well for Glenn Youngkin. And I think what that speaks to is just the depth of the unpopularity of the issue. So he goes on offense. He tries to say, in perhaps the best state to do this, where you had your moderate Democrat governor, Ralph Northam, absolutely trashed in the state, unpopular in the state, for his late-term abortion policies and comments just a couple of years ago. So if there was anywhere that's sort of fertile ground for Republicans to do this message, it would have been Virginia, and it did not go well for Glenn Youngkin. And again, I just think that speaks to the depth of the unpopularity, that the country, especially post-Roe, is in a completely different place on abortion than people like me and than Republicans.
And I think they mislearned the Ralph Northam lesson, because for people who forget, he made some weird comments about the comments that he retracted about babies like right after birth or something.
Being kept comfortable, and then
And there was a state legislator who had like floated legislation that would allow like abortion like right up until birth, or like even after it, or something like that.
Yes.
And so the right really seized on this, and it became a national story in conservative media. But then in the next legislative elections, Democrats did just fine. Like they held their own.
Because they were like, oh no, we can't do this. Like they totally scrapped it instead of standing by it. And I mean, that's a lesson for Republicans, I guess.
Yeah, and some of it
sense
was just
too.
Northam being like, look, I misspoke. That's not what I meant. And I think some on the right were like, no, you didn't misspeak. That's really is your agenda. But I think almost all Democrats are like, no, we're going to believe he misspoke, because that's not actually what our position is on this issue. And then in those key races where that was the focal point, Democrats won. Mm-hmm. And so, but there was so much energy that I think Republicans, and particularly the pro-life crowd, were like, we can go back in and we can do this, especially after Youngkin. But they couldn't. So Susanna Gibson, this is House District 57. If you guys want to follow the votes as they come in, currently Democrats have the House of Delegates no matter what. I think it's by at least a vote. Yeah. If there are two uncalled races by the Associated Press, and one of them is Susanna Gibson. She's currently trailing her opponent Owens by roughly 2 percentage points. This is the candidate who's a nurse who was busted by Republican operatives and the Washington Post as doing sex with her husband online.
Doing sex.
Right on this website, Chatterbait, which the Washington Post incorrectly accused her of violating its terms of service.
Oh.
It was hilarious. Like the 6 paragraphs of the Washington Post, it's the first 6 paragraphs of the Washington Post article all about how she violated the terms of service by accepting tips. It's such a hilarious way to approach the issue, because liberals, they're fine with consenting adults doing everything, doing anything that they want, as long as
within the boundaries of marriage.
Within the boundaries of marriage, and as long as nobody's getting hurt. But wait, you violated the terms of service? Right. This website. So we looked into it. Turns out, no, they didn't actually. The Post and the Republican operative just misunderstood the terms of service.
They just didn't look closely enough.
They only read like a snippet and not the rest of it. So anyway, Virginia voters, stood up for people who were falsely accused of violating terms of service.
That's important. You read all the fine print.
Statewide Democrats abandoned this race. Like they tossed her aside.
She probably could have won.
She absolutely would have won.
The margin right now is really close.
And she might still win, but had Democrats not abandoned her, both their little super PAC that they've got out there, plus the kind of state leaders, then she wins. Because if she loses, it'll be by triple-digit votes.
It was, as we're talking, it was called at 51 to 48. So by some places.
Right, but not by the
everyone has
AP
called
yet.
it. Yeah, no, not everyone's called
So there's
it.
still a lot of absentee and kind of mail ballots still to be counted.
Yeah, and you know what, Ryan, I think another important thing to mention out of Virginia is that Ad Impact Politics, their study of TV ads, 40% of all of those ads in Virginia's state ledge and general elections were about abortion. And again, similar to other states we've talked about, Kentucky, Ohio, Democratic advertisers outspent Republicans by $7.7 million. And Virginia, interestingly enough, I mean, it's shocking how expensive these races were. The Senate candidates raised $94 million. The House of Delegates candidates collected $80 million. This is according to Open Secrets. That is a record because in Virginia, there actually are no limits on the amount of money that
and corporations can give. It's the loosest laws in the country.
It's absolutely insane. And that's where total fundraising by state legislative candidates, according to Open Secrets, has increased fourfold over the last 20 years. It's gone from $44.2 million in 2003 when adjusted for inflation. You look at those numbers, that is gargantuan and honestly a total waste of money.
Yes. So culture war loss in Virginia. We go to New Jersey as well. Again, you saw a situation where Republicans in New Jersey were hoping that backlash to trans policies in school districts, which were driving a lot of parents to school board meetings, produced a lot of slates to run for school board, it would bleed into the state legislative races. But as so far, what it looks like is that Democrats actually expanded their majorities in the state legislature in New Jersey. And by the way, Democrats also won some key school board elections in Virginia that were fought along these very narrow culture war arguments. And so what is going on? Why do you think the kind of Chris Rufo approach here is getting routed?
I mean, I think it always depends on the candidate. There were some weird Republican upsets too. A candidate in the Bronx.
Oh yeah.
This is a strange one. There's a candidate in the Bronx who,
what happened
a
here?
Republican woman in the Bronx who this is like history.
Usually unopposed. Like usually these are like there isn't even an opponent, a Republican opponent on the ballot.
Yeah. So it was a weird race too. Christy Marmorato. I guess I'm gonna have to learn how to say this name. It's like when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won. It was like, what?
Figure that out.
But yeah, so this is a 13th city council district. It was a really nasty race. It covers a couple neighborhoods in the eastern part of the Bronx. That's the district. Republicans haven't had, this is the New York Daily News. It refers to it as a Republican curse that swept the Bronx for nearly 20 years. They say she broke that. She had a 6% lead over the incumbent Democratic councilwoman, and they were going back and forth over public safety, land use. It was just a kind of a weird race. And she was attacking the incumbent Dem for leaning too far left. There was also a weird Republican upset in New Hampshire.
Manchester.
Right.
The mayor of Manchester.
Yeah. And the Allegheny County DA, write-in Dem who ran as a Republican on a sort of anti-Soros prosecutor line holds on there. So it was, it's pretty typical that you have these sort of this sort of smattering in an off-year election of what things actually are. Overall, the top line is it was a bad night for Republicans, of course. And actually on that note, we have results as well from Mississippi, because that was one of the bright spots for Republicans. We can put those up. This is
my man Tate Reeves.
Literally your man. A lot of people, if you weren't watching last week, we debated whether or not Ryan actually looks like Tate Reeves, because apparently people tell you do.
That is one good-looking gentleman right there. I just want to congratulate him on his triumph over Elvis Presley's second cousin there.
So he wins 50, about 52 to 47. So fairly close for a deep red state like Mississippi.
Presley was hoping to keep him under 50, which would have forced a runoff.
Presley's kind of a wannabe Bashir, right? Someone who's able to do the kind of populist Dem thing in a red state.
Yes, and he's doing it in an even redder state. So sometimes just the objective conditions that you're faced with just make it impossible for even the best politician, because his track record is pretty incredible. He was a popular mayor in a Republican area. This is Brandon Presley. And then he's been a multi-term member of the Public Commission Board in Mississippi, representing a thoroughly Republican area. And he defines himself as like an FDR style populist. And to get that close with a Republican in Mississippi is pretty impressive, although the state does seem to be increasingly trending blue. Like, are we going to see a time when enough people, combination of the Democratic population growth in the area plus people just moving there for cheaper cost of living?
I mean, well, I think, and this is
makes it blue.
This is where I think Dems have, to again paraphrase the Reagan bold colors, not pale pastels thing. This is where I think Dems have actually seen the writing on the wall when they see Bernie Sanders sweep in 2016. Win places like Wisconsin. Those populist left policies are incredibly popular with those kind of voters that maybe the Obama-Trump person
and Presley's from northern Mississippi, which is has some Appalachian character, right?
Right, an incredibly
correct me if I'm
poor
wrong,
state. I mean, the people there suffer a lot, and so I think FDR-style Democratic policies, as opposed to Biden-style Democratic policies, are probably the way to go.
All right, so let's talk about Pennsylvania real quick.
Speaking of which,
yeah. So a huge victory for Democrats in the Supreme Court race. So they had a 5-2 majority on the Supreme Court, which is just incredibly crucial because that's the place where election challenges go. This would have made it 4-3, but the Democrat won very comfortably against the Republican in a race that saw a lot of money spent on both sides. They also flipped the Superior Court, which is the court just right under the Supreme Court. It had been Republican controlled. Now it's Democratic controlled. And then out in, talk about Philadelphia real quick. So Philadelphia has 2 council seats. DC has this too, that are reserved for the non-majority party because it's such a blue area that it would just be all Democrats if you didn't put in some rules so that everybody gets a trophy.
Yeah.
And for years, those have been held by Republicans. So there's like the 2 token Republicans on the city council. The Working Families Party last election went after those 2 seats. One of them with Kendra Brooks. She won re-election, and they also, WFP now seized the other one. So you're going to have a city council that's Democrats and then Working Families Party. Now over in Western Pennsylvania, you had two really critical races. One was the district attorney race that you talked about. So the 6-term prosecutor, kind of tough on crime prosecutor, was beaten in the primary by a kind of, like you said, a criminal justice reformer. I don't know if he was Soros funded or not, but that type of challenger. He then switched, like the Buffalo sheriff did, switched parties, did a write-in campaign to win the Republican nomination, won the Republican nomination, and then won the general election by like 2 points or something. So he will be entering his 7th term now as continuing to be the tough on crime prosecutor. The real win that Republicans wanted was the Allegheny County executive, which is more powerful than Pittsburgh mayor, budget of billions, oversees the elections in Pittsburgh. And Sarah Innamorato was a Bernie-crat and had been elected to the state house in 2018 along with Summer Lee with the support of DSA, won the Democratic primary for this race. Republicans nominated this guy, something Rocky, I forget his first name. Joe Rocky?
Joe Rocky.
Just classic pro-business, moderate, backslapping former banker.
It's like a name you would make up for that character.
Yeah. Jeff Yass, big Republican funder who spent a ton of money on the Supreme Court race, also spent a ton of money on Joe Rocky. And he tried to make the entire race about Hamas.
Right.
And obviously it's an extra resonant issue in Pittsburgh. The Tree of Life massacre has made anti-Semitism there extraordinarily resonant.
And robust Jewish community.
And Innamorato had that association with DSA. So Rocky said, I dare you to denounce Hamas. And she's like, I denounce Hamas. He's like, I dare you to denounce DSA. She's like, I left DSA in 2019. I denounced DSA too. Summer Lee left in 2018. But it was he still kind of hammered away at Gaza as a key issue, which was, didn't make any sense because Allegheny County executive doesn't. But her response didn't make much sense either. Her response was, this is actually about abortion. But the Allegheny County executive does not also have much say.
Our politics are so stupid.
What it's really about is taxes, affordable housing, clean air, clean water. Like that's what the Allegheny County executive actually does. But the vote was over abortion and Hamas.
Those
And so
top-line
it was,
culture war
yeah,
issues.
It was much closer than you would typically have a Democrat, a generic Democrat on generic Republican Allegheny County race. She's only going to win by, looks like 10,000 votes or fewer.
Yeah.
But still, now you're going to have a kind of Bernie Sanders type and she's pledging to make affordable housing and clean air and clean water and access to clean air and clean water like her major priorities.
Yeah, I mean, anybody running for a county executive race should probably take heed. Those are good issues to talk about.
Yeah. Whereas Rocky said he was going to cut property taxes.
Yeah. So if we put A10 up, I think this is also, just as we kind of wrap this segment, this review of everything that went down last night, I just want to put the spending up for you to see Republicans were outspent in Kentucky. They were outspent in Virginia. They were outspent in Ohio. They did outspend Dems in Mississippi by about $1 million. They massively overspent the Republicans in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court race. I mean, not even close.
Jeff Yass needs to step up. Why
Clearly.
is he being so cheap here?
I know. Well, I mean, yeah, this is like a real problem for Republicans, obviously, getting the donor base mobilized and energized, the sort of high-dollar donor race. But yeah, I mean, I just think that's it's true that...
10 million, for people that don't see it, 10 million for Democrats on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to 6.5 million. But if you're Jeff Yass, why don't you just match the 10 million?
Why not?
Come on.
Just throw it in there, see what happens. Because that really, I mean, in local races, I don't think it's necessarily true in presidential races. If you look at Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, I mean, it's not quite the same. But in local races, when you are blitzing the airwaves with messaging that's either true or false, when it comes to abortion, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to crime, when you're able to do that, and you can be louder than the other person, that does actually make a really big difference in some of these smaller down ballot races and in more localized races too. So again, that isn't to say limiting abortion is wildly popular. I think that people on the sort of pro-life, anti-abortion side like myself desperately need to realize that and reckon with it. But they were also wildly outspent, and that could have made up some of these margins. There's just no question about it. So now Republicans need to take a long, hard look in the mirror. I already saw some comments from pundits on Twitter about whether too much money is going to Trump's legal battles, whether too much money is being mismanaged by the RNC. Ronna Romney McDaniel has been the head of that for a very long time, and she's had Trump, obviously, to contend with as an electoral benefit and disadvantage in different places throughout her tenure, but these are really bad results for her. Yeah. Not that Republicans weren't expecting bad results, but still bad.
Well, I think that was our longest A block in history, Counterpoints history. You could even throw in Rising history, and that never been a longer A block than that one.
So you're welcome.
Yeah. Let's move on now to what I think is the most morally depraved thing that Congress has done, at least in my lifetime, and that is to censure Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American serving in Congress, while the U.S. is supporting an ongoing massacre of Palestinians. I saw somebody point out on Twitter that the second person ever censured by Congress was censured for introducing a resolution proposing the abolition of slavery, which you weren't even allowed to talk about in Congress. There was a literal gag rule, and so for proposing that resolution, they censured the person. I think the absolute moral depravity on display in the House yesterday is just leaves me kind of speechless. There was some pushback, and so Mark Pocan here has been engaged in an ongoing war of words with AIPAC. We were hoping to have him on today, actually, to talk about this. His schedule didn't work. We're hoping to have him next week. This is a Wisconsin Democrat who has kind of eagerly been taking on the slings and arrows from AIPAC, and he's said publicly the one reason he's doing it is if he doesn't do it, they're just going to attack mostly the women of color and serving in the House for Democrats and some men of color as well. Jamal Bowman has been a kind of fiery opponent of AIPAC, which is trying to recruit, and it seems like they successfully have recruited a primary opponent to him as well. Here he is unleashing on AIPAC, which is airing ads against him. He says, when little kids in my district sit down to watch a princess movie, AIPAC is forcing them to watch lies about the worst violence people could possibly do to each other. As a father, it makes me sick. One of the things, and we'll play some of these in a second. One of the things that drove me the craziest about the debate yesterday, it's not just, I think, just on a free speech issue.
Yeah.
Just a free speech level, it's outrageous to censure a member of Congress. Jamie Raskin made the argument for Democrats on the House floor, and I thought he made a good one. He said, if anybody is going to censure or discipline a member of Congress for their speech, it should be their voters.
Agreed.
And he goes on and he says, there are 11 members of the chamber who voted to say that Turkey did not commit a genocide against Armenia. Should we censure them for that vote? And he went on, talked about Mike Johnson and his views on marriage equality.
Yep.
Should he be censured? And Raskin was making the point that Democrats are now going to be under extreme pressure from their party's base to censure people in return. So to me, all they've done is just like they've taken impeachment and made it kind of a moot power by overusing it. I think so you get censured now. It's going to end up becoming a badge of honor, because what it means is that you angered the other party. So just on a free speech level, it was really offensive to me. But the other level was the way that they weren't even censuring her for what she believed. Like they kept twisting her words and saying, we're censuring her because she supports Hamas and she supports the eradication of Israel.
Right.
If she did, then even if she did that, I think on a free speech level, you should not censure her. Like, vote her out of Congress if you don't like that. But that's also not what she says. Like, she has condemned Hamas. She does not support the eradication of Israel. And so you wound up with a bunch of these Republican speeches of saying, well, this is how we interpret what she's saying, regardless of the fact that she says that that's not what she's saying.
Yeah.
And then we're going to condemn and censure that interpretation of it.
I think it's entirely reasonable for Jews to hear from the river to the sea and have incredible sensitivities about it, because obviously it's appropriated and used by people who do actually really want to, in some cases completely eradicate Jews, and in other cases eradicate Israel in a way that it's like, well, where do Jewish people go? Are they safe? So I completely understand heightened sensitivities around from the river to the sea. She also, actually, a lot of people forget about this, back in 2020, she had to undo a retweet of From the River to the Sea, which if you are a pro-Palestinian activist in the United States, or basically anywhere, and you are a big voice that's interacting with all of these other accounts, it's such a common phrase, from the river to the sea. And people can argue, again, people with, I think, reasonably heightened sensitivities about that can argue what that means. But in the same way, and I agree with Jamie Raskin on this, in the same way that we often talk about, I talk all the time about how the House of Representatives, we lose sight of the fact that it is essentially supposed to be representative. It's supposed to be where voters who have ideas across the spectrum, because they live in different geographic locations, are given a voice in Congress. And sometimes that means it feels icky to people. And that can go for Republicans and it can go for Democrats. Rashida Tlaib represents a heavily Muslim district in Michigan, where what she's doing on this issue is fully representative of her constituents. So don't censure her. Make this a political question. You can censure somebody if they're not representing their constituents and they're being sort of wildly hateful and bigoted in a way that's different than what they got elected on. This is completely representative of her constituents. There's just no question about it. So you're going to need to beat her at the ballot box. I think a censure is a waste of time, and I think it's just an exercise in virtue signaling.
Right, and there's a couple interesting points to make there. One is that the Likud platform, Netanyahu's party, includes From the River to the Sea in its platform. And it says that Israeli sovereignty extends.
From the Israeli perspective.
Yeah. So and then Hamas in its charter would say that Israelis and Jewish people need to be pushed out
which
of the entire thing.
And by the way, I think that's why there's heightened sensitivities among pro-Palestinian people about when you hear Israeli lawmakers, for example, or you hear Max Miller talking about turning Gaza into a parking lot. It's an eradication of the Palestinian state, and people say, well, where are we supposed to go? So I feel like those heightened sensitivities are completely understandable when you hear people talking about either eradicating Gaza or eradicating Israel.
Right. And what Tlaib says she means, and what so many other people do mean by that, is that everyone living from the river to the sea should have dignity, the franchise, and the same civil rights as anybody else living in there. There are some supporters of Israel who say that that would destroy Israel. And there are other people who say, well, then what is Israel if the people who are under its control can't have basic civil rights?
Yeah.
How can you support that? So what she is standing for is basically a one-state solution in which everyone in this area is a part of a democratic polity. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can't have a Jewish character in its constitution. It doesn't mean that Jewish people from around the world can't still have Israel as a refuge. It doesn't mean that Hebrew wouldn't be the national language. It would mean that a Palestinian, just by virtue of being a Palestinian, would not have lesser rights than an Israeli settler like living right next to them. That the settlers would not be able to just seize their homes. That if a Palestinian is accused of a crime, that the Palestinian would go to a civil court and have rights in court, rather than, as currently is the case for most, is put into a military court and held in indefinite administrative detention with no rights whatsoever, or just executed.
And it's sort of impossible to envision the path from point A to point B to this hypothetical one-state solution. And again, I get why that's, there are heightened sensitivities on that, because it's like, well, what does that look like? Are we talking about the what did y'all think decolonize meant tweet? Because there was just a civilian massacre and perpetrated by essentially the de facto government of Gaza. And so I get it. I totally understand why people have heightened sensitivities around this. And I think as a congresswoman, she is obviously sort of sensitive to those sensitivities, because I think she took the video down and she undid the retweet. Again, to be clear, she's not the one who said "from the river to the sea." She tweeted a video of people chanting "from the river to the sea," which I also think is a distinction. But either way, the point is Republicans and pro-Israel Democrats want to have it both ways. They want to say there's this shocking uptick in anti-Semitic sentiment, which I think there's good reason to believe that. They want to say there's this shocking anti-Israel sentiment around the country, but also we can't have this in the House of Representatives. Well, if there's a shocking amount of it in the country, it's going to be in the House of Representatives, and you're going to have to defeat it rhetorically. You're going to have to defeat it politically. You're going to have to grapple with it. You can't just censure it and pretend that it doesn't exist and that it's outside the bounds of what normal Americans think, because there are people chanting intifada in the streets. That's something you have to deal with as a politician.
Right, and which is not what she's doing. So, it's this endless effort to kind of transform criticism of what Israel is doing into anti-Semitism, rather than address head-on what Israel is doing. And the idea that this is the debate that the House was happening while people are starving, people are dying of not just under rubble, but from disease, from not having access to food and water for more than a month at this point. But let's play some of the debate from the House floor yesterday.
I can't believe I have to say this, but Palestinian people are not disposable. We are human beings, just like anyone else. My city, my grandmother, like all Palestinians, just wants to live her life with freedom and human dignity we all deserve. Speaking up to save lives, Mr. Chair, no matter faith, no matter ethnicity, should not be controversial in this chamber. The cries of the Palestinian and Israeli children sound no different to me. Why? What I don't understand is why the cries of Palestinians sound different to you all. 71% of Michigan Democrats support a ceasefire. So you can try to censure me, but you can't silence their voices. I urge my colleagues to join with the majority of Americans and support a ceasefire now to save as many lives as possible. President Biden must listen to and represent all of us, not just some of us. I urge the president to have the courage to call for a ceasefire and the end of killings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is glaring hypocrisy when you have Republicans on the other side of the aisle trying to create definitions and say Rashida wants to annihilate people, when Max Miller himself went on TV and said we're turning Gaza into a parking lot and we want to annihilate Palestinians. Nobody condemned him on that side of the aisle. What is true here is that every single one of them has not acknowledged the fact that Palestinians are dying in the tens of thousands, but will continue to say it is us who are not acknowledging humanity. Rashida will stand strong.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
The movement will continue for liberation until every single
Gentlelady's time has expired.
has the right to
Gentleman
live
from
in
Maryland
liberty.
is recognized.
All right, so we also have clips of Trip Roy, or we have video of Trip Roy from the floor yesterday. We can run that right now, too.
What we're talking about is whether a member of the United States House of Representatives, whether a member of this body representing this nation is justified in putting forward a defense of the actions of Hamas terrorists that murdered innocent Israeli citizens, is holding United States citizens and Israelis hostage, and in her own language was defending on October 8th, a mere 24 hours into the brutal and barbaric attacks in which babies were beheaded, babies were placed into ovens, literally. Moms were raped in a house while their babies were put in an oven. A documented account, video evidence. And this is dismissed as resistance to an apartheid state.
So, I think I'm with Chip Roy's Freedom Caucus colleague Thomas Massey in voting against the censure thing. I think there was a handful of Republicans that voted with some of the Democrats and a handful of Democrats, I think 22 Democrats that did vote to censure Rashida Tlaib, a much smaller number of Republicans who voted with Democrats not to do it. That obviously ended up passing last night. Ryan, you actually have your book here on the desk.
That's right.
It's got the faces of some of the people you just heard from. Yeah,
apparently yours hasn't showed up yet.
It's a beautiful hard copy, a beautiful cover. But as somebody who's covered very closely The Squad, it's a perfect book title, for a long time now. It's a nice book. What did you make of their exchanges yesterday, which were really personal on the House floor, just among Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar? What did that tell us about some of those dynamics?
Yeah, and for people who are just listening on the podcast, while you hear kind of Tlaib choking up, Ilhan Omar kind of comes up and puts a hand on her shoulder. You see Pramila Jayapal behind her, wiping tears away. They've been forged in this fight with AIPAC, which dates back to their rise. Like the books, bizarrely, half the book really focuses on this fight over Israel-Palestine issues, when that is not at all the book that I set out to write. But going back kind of through their trajectory in Congress, it was the case that made up about like half of their struggle and reshaped it through the way that AIPAC and DMFI entered into the kind of the Democratic primaries in 2022, making sure that anybody who was remotely critical of Israel was either pushed out or reframed their position completely. And so Democratic Majority for Israel, which has been so influential, was founded in February 2019 as a very direct and immediate and specific response to Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib being sworn into Congress. Not anything they did, their presence Like the fact that they had made it into Congress was enough to push back on them. Then you had the first 6 months of 2019 just devoted to the question of whether or not Ilhan Omar should be censured for various criticisms that she made. You had that famous Benjamin's tweet that she did apologize for, and so the amount of time that was consumed by this issue was shocking. But to see its kind of climax here with this attempted ethnic cleansing of Gaza, I think shows that what they were going through was not just made up. Like this is a real thing, kind of reshaping democratic politics. And when we talk about ethnic cleansing, I'm curious for your take on this. It's not just debating a term and whether or not the word genocide should be used or not. It's like you have people who have studied genocide for decades, academics. You have people at the United Nations who've looked at this, extremely closely. All of them saying that the question of intent is always the hardest to prove. But what Israeli officials have been saying publicly about their intent, basically to clear out Gaza, creates the predicate for genuine, serious allegations of genocide, which the United States and Israel are both actively participating in. And it's one of the more shocking things. It's not that it's necessarily out of character for the United States to support something like this, yet seeing it unfold has just been shocking. It feels like a piece of me has died, like watching this unfold. And to hear the Biden administration say, we think that they're going overboard here. This is too much. But there's just nothing we can do. Oh, and also, let's make sure that they have tens of billions of dollars with no strings attached, is just insulting to the kind of ethical and moral fiber of, I think, everybody who's just watching this unfold and feeling a sense of complicity in it.
They also want to quote blank check and no strings attached in Ukraine. That's sort of how we've run our foreign policy, recently. And I completely disagree on the question of genocidal intent. That said, Shadi Hamid had a really good, over at the Washington Post, had a really good tweet about the way that even we prosecuted a bad war in Iraq with precision compared to. So if you thought that war lacked precision, obviously Gaza is a difficult situation for Israel to mount any type of response without bringing civilian casualties to staggering levels. But even so, the difference in precision in Iraq and in Gaza and the way those wars have been prosecuted is serious. And that's something I think lawmakers who are talking so much about aid to Israel need to seriously consider. And actually, we're going to talk about that in the next block. My final question for you, Ryan, just because you've covered this so closely, is they've been able to paper over these huge personal divisions between a Rashida Tlaib and a Hakeem Jeffries on the question of Israel, between an Ilhan Omar and a Nancy Pelosi on the question of Israel. Is this a moment where you have Democrats crossing the aisle actually to censure Rashida Tlaib, where perhaps the squad finally goes full Freedom Caucus and totally breaks with leadership? Or will they still be able to work together going forward?
And I don't think so, because leadership did not break with them on this.
That's true.
And the leader of the kind of the Democratic forces who sided with Republicans to censure Tlaib was Josh Gottheimer, who had multiple chapters are dedicated to Josh Gottheimer in this book, and he has been their most consistent antagonist throughout his time there, and he was kind of one of the first to jump out and say that he's going to support the censure of Rashida Tlaib here. I do think that it is giving them, I think it's giving people around the country something to believe in again, who had lost faith that there was anybody fighting for justice in Congress. And so I do think that could be one of the developments here. But also, what I think people need to understand, we love in the U.S. here to abstract away from the reality of the depravity of what we do around the world by talking about words and phrases and politics and horse race instead. But that doesn't change the reality on the ground. And I think that the devastation and the death toll in Gaza that we're going to finally have to accept as real in the coming weeks and months will change the way that people see this.
I think social media is completely undercutting the blob's ability to talk in abstractions. And when you look at public polling on Gaza and Palestinians, especially among the youngest people, which has been shocking to a lot of pro-Israel folks, a lot of the Republican Party, you have to understand that these devastating images of suffering in Gaza are flooding people's social media feeds. And that is really hurting, I think, people's ability to talk about these things in abstractions. By the way, the same thing happened on October 7th as some of these massacres were being live streamed.
Yes.
The abstractions are getting much more difficult, I think, for the foreign policy elite to carry on with.
And I think what happened on October 7th with some people who either defended what Hamas did or didn't denounce it is that they had such tightly curated kind of feeds that they didn't even know. And because they didn't have the kind of curiosity or the willingness to kind of look outside their feed, because they might not want to hear the answer to what had actually happened, and then they're locked into a position, and pride and ego kind of won't let them back down from that. But again, we're talking about people who are at the fringes of power, like way out, like just people who like can't even get a hearing inside DSA for the most part, rather than what we have on the other side, people like Congressman Mast, who Ilhan Omar talked about in her speech yesterday, who has said, I would caution my colleagues to use the phrase innocent civilians, because you wouldn't use the phrase innocent Nazi civilians, and who has said that Israel ought to turn Gaza into a parking lot.
That was Max Miller.
Oh, sorry, Max Miller. What did Mast say? Oh, Mast said the first thing and Miller said the other thing. So this is two separate members of Congress. These are not anonymous people on a university chat board.
You know, and yeah, I think also, first of all, not only did we just destroy our longest A block in the history of counterpoints, I think we just did our longest B block in the history of counterpoints, but that's actually a transition, I think, to the next block about how these are translating into the funding questions, because Ilhan Omar did invoke yesterday what Max Miller said on the floor and said, how dare you censure Rashida Tlaib when nobody has said a word about Max Miller claiming we're going to turn Gaza into a parking lot. And yeah, I guess we can put, we're about to play some clips of a bitter fight that broke out on the Senate yesterday that did not get a lot of attention, but is super instructive because Republicans are trying to separate aid to Israel from aid to Ukraine.
And the context for this is a wild statement from out of Ukraine from President Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't even want to set it up. Let's just play this clip from President Zelensky.
If you can't give us some financial support, okay, please give us a credit, and we will give you back money.
Okay, the idea.
This is like your uncle at Thanksgiving.
Like, please, like the idea that Ukraine would wage a stalemated at best war, on credit, which they would then presumably pay back by selling off what remaining state assets they've held on to since the collapse of the Soviet Union, sounds like the worst possible deal for regular Ukrainians that you could possibly conjure up.
Absolutely.
And people say, well, what's the alternative? That Russia conquers the entire thing? No, that's not the alternative. The alternative is a ceasefire and you enter into negotiations.
Yeah.
Like, which was what should have happened, in the very beginning.
Yeah, I was thinking
under better conditions.
No, I was thinking this week actually about something you said a couple years ago, or I think maybe you said it a year ago about peace negotiations that had been scuttled, and I think at the time it was Naftali Bennett who had broken some information about the West America scuttling peace negotiations in Ukraine that even Zelensky had been open to, and then looking back and looking at we have a hard time knowing the death tolls, but even in that wonderful Time magazine piece, and I say wonderful because it was so insightful in a way that I don't think the Beltway wanted it to be, into the war, estimates of 100,000 casualties at least on each side of this. How many of those could have been avoided if the peace negotiations hadn't been scuttled? And how many, if we're going to talk about this a year from now and peace negotiations start in earnest, could have been avoided or could be avoided in the next year if we finally recognize that this is a stalemate? So in the Senate, Republicans tried to divorce the Ukraine aid from the Israel aid. They're also trying to tie it to a border bill that, from my perspective, we probably disagree on this. It deals a lot with asylum. It deals with funding to a wall, but I think probably the biggest thing in the bill is asylum. It was part of a bill that was passed by the House recently. That is something they're also trying to tie to the Israel funding, to Ukraine funding. They're trying to bring it all together. This came to a head yesterday with Jeanne Shaheen, Chris Van Hollen, Democrats in the Senate freaking out. And Roger Marshall and J.D. Vance kind of giving it back to them. So let's play this mashup of Democrats in the Senate yesterday.
We, the United States, must support our friends and democracies that are under attack from brutal adversaries. That means ensuring that Israel has the right to defend itself in the aftermath of the brutal October 7th attack of Hamas. It also means ensuring that the people of Ukraine can defend themselves against Putin's rank aggression. This proposal on the floor today is tantamount to surrendering to Putin's aggression. This is waving the white flag. All of us were gathered in the old Senate chamber, most of us, recently when President Zelensky addressed the United States Senate. President Zelensky was very clear that the Ukrainians would continue to fight on no matter what. But he was equally clear that without the support of the United States and our allies, Putin has the upper hand.
The Ukrainian people are not only defending their land and freedom, they're fighting for the preservation of liberal democracies around the world. What some of my colleagues overlook in their singular campaign in support of Israel is just how closely the fate of Ukraine and Israel are tied together. And there's one country which links both of those countries together. That country is Iran.
I'm sorry, that is insane. Let's hear from Senator Vance, who is responding to this.
Colleagues may forget that a matter of weeks ago, a matter of months ago, there were people in this chamber, there were people in the United States of America demanding that the state of Israel give money and weapons to the Ukrainians, money and weapons that the Israelis are now using this very moment to defend themselves. The idea that these policies are not in tension with one another, the idea that what happens in Russia and Ukraine is separate from what happens in Israel is not just obvious, it is common sense, and it has been borne out by the reality of the last couple of weeks. Now, my colleagues would like to collapse these packages. Too many of my colleagues would like to collapse these packages because they would like to use Israel as a political fig leaf for the president's Ukraine policy. But the president's Ukraine policy, just like the Israeli policy, should be debated. We should talk about it. We should discuss it. We should separate the costs and benefits and analyze them as distinct policies, because that is what the American people deserve of their legislature.
And they know full well what they came up with is a total non-starter. Instead of putting together common sense border policies that can pass in divided government, Senate Republicans basically copy and pasted large chunks of the House's radical H.R. 2 bill. And that's their asking price for helping Ukraine. Making Ukraine funding conditional on the hard-right border policies that can't ever pass Congress is a huge mistake by our Republican colleagues. By tying Ukraine to border, Republicans are sadly making it harder, much harder, for us to help Ukraine in their fight against Putin. It sends a terrible signal to both our friends and adversaries. It will be a moment that history will remember.
Okay, so you heard Chuck Schumer following J.D. Vance there. And to be clear, they're talking about two different things. J.D. Vance and Roger Marshall tried to vote unanimous consent yesterday on a bill the House passed last week that gives $14 billion to Israel. And it's paid for by cuts to the IRS. 12 Democrats voted for it. On the House side, that was obviously going to be very difficult for any Senate Democrats to do. But what you heard wasn't so much opposition to the IRS funding cuts. You heard from Jeanne Shaheen, and you're hearing this also from Chuck Schumer talking about the border. That is a separate initiative which says, okay, Biden, you want us to have money for both Israel and Ukraine tied together, then you're also going to make these changes to the asylum process. That argument that this is all interconnected, thus it must be funded at the same level. Ryan, what do you make of it?
And I think the reason they didn't criticize the IRS funding portion of this is because then Republicans would say, okay, fine, we'll get rid of the IRS funding and we'll just give the money to Israel, or we will find some other way to pay for Israel funding, because it's, to your point, that's not their main objection. I mean, it's a non-starter. The IRS stuff is a non-starter, but their main objection is that it's not collapsed together. That they want to move Ukraine money and Israel money at the same time.
They know Israel's popular. They know Ukraine is waning in popularity. So if they can tie it to Israel, they know it has a better chance of passing.
But what's interesting is that they could probably pass both.
Probably,
like there is growing opposition to Ukraine funding in the Republican Party. There's not a lot of evidence that there's a lot of opposition to it among Democrats, even on the left. And so there are enough Republicans that could probably move it through. Now they're insisting on, but I'd be curious for your take on that. You know the Republican Party better than me, but now they're insisting on tying it to these border policies. And I think Democrats would actually love to be dragged kicking and screaming towards some tough immigration policy. But not that stuff. Like there are things that they would like to have done so that the political issue is taken off the table a little bit. Without their fingerprints being on it. But that's not it.
It's like Republicans on abortion.
Right. And do Republicans want? I think some Republicans like the issue.
I think
they don't want to solve it.
The White House, interestingly enough, has signaled some willingness to work on potential border policies. So that's kind of an interesting negotiating chip, especially because the House is it's such a tight majority lead in the House of Representatives. And the White House knows that. They know they desperately want to get funding for both Israel and Ukraine. I think the real bargaining chip within the immigration bill, that H.R. 2 that was basically, as Chuck Schumer said, copy and pasted, is going to be DACA, is going to be asylum for people who were brought here as children. That's going to be, I think, where Republicans and Democrats might be able to find common ground if the White House actually decides to play ball on this question, which might be its best option going forward because of the way the House of Representatives is. And to your point, a lot of people on the right see Ukraine funding as Mike Johnson's big litmus test. How is he going to be a speaker? That will be determined by how he handles this question of resisting blob pressures to keep the spigot running with Ukraine. Even Kevin McCarthy was sort of further right on that than most of the Republican Party establishment. So, could they probably pass something? Yes, because even Mike Johnson and even Senate, or even House Republicans, Freedom Caucus people understand that there can be room for some Ukraine funding. It's just this keeping the spigot on to the degree that it is on with these funding levels that they're resisting. So if they come to the table, they can get something done. It might be having to come to the table on border stuff, though.
Yeah, both parties love war, so don't bet against military funding making it through.
Never
unless you want to lose money.
That's right. Actually, though, Ryan, speaking of that sort of two-party consensus and the two-party norm being broken, this is stunning. And Saagar is the first person I actually saw pick up on this. Everybody
actually read the poll that the New York Times did.
He decided to dig into the crosstabs, and everybody was talking about the Times Siena poll. It was rattling through the Beltway. Everyone was focused on the numbers of Biden hemorrhaging support from black voters, for example, and him being down in all of these swing states. Saagar looks at this, and we can put the first element up on the screen, and realizes it says something fascinating about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s bid for the presidency. This New York Times poll found him running at really tight margins. Yeah, the top line has him, I don't have it in front of me, it was 35 for Trump, 33 for Biden, was it 24? Yeah. So to repeat, in case you think that you misheard me. Yeah. This is in 6 battleground states. Yeah. Trump at 35%,
Biden at 33%, which is closer to Trump than Biden was without Kennedy in. And with Kennedy in, he was pulling 24% of the vote. That is higher than Ross Perot ever polled.
Yep, Sagar pointed that out. He never broke the 20% threshold in polling.
I feel like I remember him breaking it before. Perot did this bizarre thing where he was doing extremely well, and then he dropped out because he said that like Democrats had threatened his daughter's wedding or something like that.
Sounds right.
And then months later, he jumped back in, and people were like, okay, we knew you were a little bit weird, but now we're like really confused.
He ends up with about 19%.
And he ended up at 19%, and a lot of people think that that helped elect Bill Clinton.
Absolutely, yeah. It's hard to, those numbers are pretty, that's a pretty good case.
Because it's hard to know exactly who they would have gone for, but yeah, I think that's right. Clinton ended up with like 43% of the vote and won the White House. And so you already have RFK Jr. polling higher than Ross Perot kind of ever did. And he's within 9 points of Biden and 11 points of Trump. And if he can get somebody like an Elon Musk, David Sachs, these other tech billionaires that love him, to fund him getting on the ballot across the country.
Costs a lot.
But it's a drop in the bucket for these guys. Then he's on the ballot, and if the polling shows that he's not a spoiler, but could actually win, it becomes a wild contest.
Completely.
Because when 70% of the country, roughly, is telling you that they do not want a Biden-Trump rematch, and you tell them, too bad, you're getting a Biden-Trump rematch, and then you get a guy named RFK Jr. on the ballot, and then you're told he's actually viable.
Huge name recognition right off the bat, automatically.
100% name recognition, basically.
Yep.
And then you have the combination of the people who voted for Trump in 2016 as a middle finger to the system because they don't like it, they just want to flip it over.
Right.
Do those people go back to Trump, or do those people flip it over again by going to RFK Jr.? It's wild.
Well, and another thing, this is D2. We can put this up on the screen that was pointed out. When you look further at these crosstabs, RFK Jr., and this isn't actually really that surprising, but he beats both Trump and Biden among voters under 45 in these 6 swing states. So if you're looking at, again, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin, he is in the lead with voters 18 through 29. So people aged 18 through 29, he has 34% level of support, and then a 31% level of support with 30 to 44-year-olds. So from the ages of 18 to 44, those are great numbers. Trump, with those 18 to 29-year-olds, is at 29%. So he's losing to RFK Jr. by 5 points. Biden is at 30%. So he's losing to RFK Jr. by 4 points with those 18 to 29-year-olds. I mean, again, even in the 30 to 44% range, or 30 to 44-year-old range, Trump and Biden are each at 30%. RFK Jr. is at 31%. So he's winning with voters in swing states up to the age of 44 years old.
And the assumption among kind of the consultant class is always that as you get closer to the election, the third-party candidate dwindles in support as people realize that they don't have any chance.
Yeah.
And so that'll be the key question. Like, when people go to vote, do they think he actually has a chance? And if they think he has zero chance, then a lot of the people who are telling pollsters that they're going to support RFK Jr. as a kind of protest to those pollsters end up saying, well, okay, if it's between Biden or Trump, here's the person that I prefer out of those two. But if they go into the polls thinking that it's actually a live three-way race, you know, who knows what they end up doing. And it is fascinating that he does appear to be pulling more votes from Trump than from Biden. Like, he seems to be a net benefit to Biden unless he beats Biden.
Well, that's the thing the thing I was just going to say is, actually, I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about the RFK Jr. candidacy is that as soon as he announced he was running independent, the Republican Party started sending out, like that day, it was Columbus Day, in my inbox, I'm seeing from the RNC oppo on RFK Jr. And obviously he'd been sort of going through the conservative talk show circuit or podcast circuit, the podcast circuit kind of in general, not just conservative shows. I don't think we've seen this candidacy get going yet, to your point about David Sachs and other very wealthy people who we know are actually already interested, very interested in the RFK Jr. candidacy, either because they support him on all of the issues or because they so despise the Trump-Biden matchup that they just want to throw it all into a state of chaos. And so that's what I'm really curious about going forward as Republicans start to point out that RFK Jr. has a fairly statist record across the board on environmental issues. He was pretty supportive of Hillary Clinton. Does that sort of start resonating with normie Dems? Because a lot of normie Dems are so sick of Biden to the point where they could be persuaded if they find out that RFK Jr. was close with Hillary Clinton and maybe isn't quite as crazy as they were told he was. He used to run in fairly establishment Democratic circles. So as Republicans start to hit him as an establishment Democrat, does that make normie Dems take another look at him? And do these numbers start changing? That, I think, is a really interesting question, especially if more money is attached to it, and especially if, we've talked about this before, the Woody Harrelsons of Hollywood start to get behind the campaign too, and it just becomes a more high-profile bid that the media is forced to cover.
And if we can put up this third element, which is a new study finding that media confidence in the U.S. has matched its 2016 record low, what that means is that there really isn't a Walter Cronkite type, who's able to come in and referee this.
Yes, exactly.
And say, you know what, the gates are closed, these two dudes are in, and nobody else can come in. The other point is that the rules around presidential debates are that previously had been that if you're at 15% or above, you're supposed to be on the debate stage. So does RFK Jr. get to be on the debate stage?
A fantastic question. And he's starting to, he's in that direction right now. The Gallup poll, I think, actually explains across the board, this is my theory. I don't think it's, we don't have like clear statistics on this, but I think it explains why Biden is sort of flailing across the board and why even Trump is struggling against RFK Jr. among younger voters, because the gatekeepers lack the power, the monopoly on truth is being eroded every single election cycle, and I think we take that for granted. Even here on a show like Counterpoints and Breaking Point, sometimes we lose sight of how different it is that we get to do what we do, as opposed to 10 years ago, where to do what we did would be, you would have to do it at a publication, sort of a different, news outlet or something like that. And it was, read in left circles or right circles. But to be able to have audiences that we have at this level, because this has been democratized by, to some extent, social media, to some extent by the internet and things like YouTube, it's incredible. By the podcast sphere exploding. I just think people, it's happened so quickly that people don't realize how much that's affecting the way, for example, Black voters look at Joe Biden. When he's dropping significantly with Black voters from 2020 post-COVID to 2024 potentially, I do think a lot of that is because trust in media is plummeting and the new options are coming in to replace the bad old options.
And on the substance of RFK Jr., he's recently been a strident supporter of Israel's war on Gaza.
Yes.
And has even gone so far as to applaud a bunch of universities that have, say, like delisted organizations that they say are supportive of Hamas. Or one of them, I think at Brandeis, was planning a candlelight vigil in memory of Palestinians who'd been killed and had their charter revoked. And RFK Jr. has been applauding that type of thing, which on the one hand cuts against all of the kind of anti-censorship, anti-cancel culture wave that he'd been riding with a lot of the podcasts that kind of had elevated him.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there has always been a Palestinian exception to cancel culture embedded in it from the very beginning.
Yes.
The best example being like Barry Weiss, being like her college career was dedicated towards literally canceling Palestinian professors, and she has never kind of said that I was wrong to do that, and has continued to kind of run cancel campaigns against people that she considers to have erred on the Israeli-Palestinian question, while also being the kind of one of the lead cheerleaders of the kind of anti-cancel culture campaign. So I think it probably won't hurt him because of that exception that has always been embedded in the kind of woke wars. But I'm curious if you think that matters at all.
It matters a lot to young voters. I mean, I think, of course, Barry Weiss and RFK Jr. would say even the most ardent anti-cancel culture people have to, they agree that they're aligned somewhere. That
Yes,
somebody
they certainly do.
drops the N-word, it's probably fine to cancel them from a job or something. That an advertiser could say, maybe you're not the face of L'Oreal anymore, or
Right.
whatever it is. But I do think young voters are polling has shown they're so much on one side of the Israel-Palestine divide, and if they're super interested in RFK Jr. and start seeing this, I mean, he has leaned into it, but is it more powerful than his other messages with young voters? How exasperated and exhausted are they with the Trump-Biden choice? That's all going to factor into this. I think that is an interesting question, especially given how big his support is with young voters and how big their support is for Palestine.
Right. And a huge portion of that 24%, I'm guessing, are people just saying, just a middle finger. Like, it's not actually necessarily support for RFK Jr. It's rejection of the two choices being offered. And some of it is genuine support for RFK Jr. because they've heard him on shows. But I think a lot of it is not, because we're still a year away.
But that's much easier to do when you have a name that people recognize and they're comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Kennedy, for example.
Cornel West is also running and getting nowhere near that kind of
Right,
support.
but when you put together, actually, that's another interesting that people aren't paying attention to. If you put together Marianne Williamson, Cornel West, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the potential for an anti-Biden candidate to sweep in is so high, and media doesn't even want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about where Marianne is polling in New Hampshire. They don't want to talk about that at all. They're just completely erasing it. They're suddenly very interested in Dean Phillips, who we have no indication, despite having a ton of money, has any popular support. So the fact that, as Sagar pointed out, media didn't pick up on this, that the New York Times had these crosstabs and is looking into, I mean, so anytime you do a poll, I don't know if Intercept ever does polling, but anytime as a news outlet you commission a poll, you are scraping that data and looking so closely for what is newsworthy, what's the hook, what's in it. And the fact that the New York Times had that in front of them, and then every other news outlet had the crosstabs to cover that poll, and nobody picked up on this or covered it until it started going viral on Twitter. It's just like, what a joke.
Yeah.
All right, well, I love that this is our last segment because it's such an afterthought, and for good reason. There's a Republican debate tonight. The candidates are down in Miami. 5 of them ended up qualifying for it, by the way. In order to qualify, you had to register 4% in either 2 national polls or 1 national poll, and 2 polls from separate early voting states. Candidates also had to have reached, according to CNN, at least 70,000 unique donors with at least 200 donors in 20 states or territories. So that means tonight we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Tim Scott. 5 of them, that means no more Mike Pence, who dropped out. Doug Burgum did not qualify. Asa Hutchinson didn't even make the second debate. So he doesn't even make the second debate, but we're now on the 3rd debate. The 4th debate has already been announced. It's going to be December 6th in Tuscaloosa, so less than a month away. It has higher polling and donor thresholds, so this could be the last debate for maybe for Chris Christie and Tim Scott. I don't know about Vivek. I think Nikki Haley, because she's surged in New Hampshire, is probably safe. DeSantis is safe for now as well.
I don't have a whole lot to say about this.
You know what? I have a lot to say about one thing, which is that the Republican Party is so stupid, and that is not news to anyone.
You think they should just cancel it?
They should not be having a debate with NBC News that is going to be moderated by Kristen Welker, who I think is one of the more fair members of the so-called mainstream media, but Lester Holt is on the record saying, quote, fairness is overrated. They added Hugh Hewitt into the debate to sort of legitimize it, to be a token conservative question asker, but there's just no reason for the RNC to be cooperating anymore with NBC News. The Blaze hosted a candidate forum in Iowa in the spring that was actually like way more helpful for Republican voters at trying to suss out what the contrast is between, a Trump, a DeSantis, a Haley, than any debate moderated by corporate journalists has been in years. All you're going to have is corporate moderators racing to out-condemn Republicans and to out-gotcha Republicans. And I think these candidates should take the toughest questions. They should subject themselves to the toughest scrutiny. scrutiny, but not under the false pretense of neutrality that Lester Holt and Kristen Welker claim. I have no problem with them being on the left. I have no problem with them being center left. They're certainly not leftists, but being sort of center left, neoliberal corporate journalists. I have no problem with that. They should be honest with it and stop lying to voters and saying that they're fair and neutral. And the Republican Party should stop letting them do that. There's no reason to let them do that anymore. If they ever want to have a good debate, they can come here to Breaking Points, Counterpoints. They can go to do the candidate forum at the Blaze. They can figure out another way to do it. But nobody wants to see this anymore. So in the absence of Ryan having not so much to say, I just had to go on my rant because it makes me so mad.
It is fun to see. I think it's useful to watch these debates just to see like what the kind of dregs of the Republican Party are seeing as potential paths forward.
Chris Christie, yeah.
Yeah, Nikki Haley trying to like hold on to some of that George W. Bush energy. Really fight. She seems like personally offended at the isolationism.
Yes.
And the kind of selective anti-war posture that has become resonant within the Republican Party, and so watching her fight that, and then.
But who on that stage is she going to fight with? I mean,
Vivek, maybe.
Maybe Vivek, yeah. But I mean, at this point, why?
Well, she doesn't seem to like him for one.
They seem to, absolutely detest each other.
So that makes it more enjoyable to watch too, because they really do seem to not like each other. I'm very glad that both Tim Scott and Nikki Haley are on there, because I want to hear more about those curtains that Tim Scott was so mad at Nikki Haley for allegedly purchasing for her United Nations residence or whatever.
Yeah.
The fact that he brought that up in that debate suggests that there is a level of animosity that you can only appreciate among politicians who've known each other for decades.
South Carolina Republicans.
Just rivals, and forced to be in the same rooms.
Yeah.
And on the same team for decades, while not so secretly hating each other and undermining each other and knifing each other.
Or is it easier for them to fight about drapes because they know they're going to have to get along down the line? So they will do this theatrical debate about drapes. I think you're right in this case that there's actually this simmering animosity that's
been
for a long time.
Didn't she say bring it, Tim?
She did. She said something so ridiculous. But that's the thing when you mentioned the point about Nikki Haley's neoconservatism. Donald Trump isn't on the stage. I mean, we should have started this segment by saying this is a debate.
He's on stage in his avatar of Vivek, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that the fact that they'll all just be arguing against Trump instead of each other because the leading candidate by a wide margin is not even on the stage. And so again, NBC News is moderating this debate, hosting this debate, putting all the money into this debate for money and credibility. And Republicans are just giving them both of it, despite talking constantly about how NBC News should be less powerful and is lacking in credibility without even having the leading candidate on the stage. There's just no reason to be doing this at this point if you're just going to let NBC News trash a bunch of Republicans in front of the country in a way that's not productive for Republican voters who this is for. Republican debates are for Republican voters to decide which candidate they want to go for. And I don't think, no offense, Lester Holt is the most qualified to help them make that decision at this point.
And I wonder if this were a Democratic debate, if NBC would be, how their approach on the question of Israel-Palestine would differ between how they focus on Democrats and how they focus on Republicans. Will you see the moderators try to pressure Republicans to condemn the collective punishment of Palestinians? There's no question collective punishment is going on. They have shut the water off. They have stopped food and other supplies from getting in. That's happening.
By their own admission.
By their own admission.
The goal, yeah.
And they say that they've given reasons why they're doing it. Does not make it comport with international law.
Right.
It is, by definition, collective punishment. Do you think that the moderators will push Republicans to condemn that? Because they would do it in any other circumstance.
I think it's a great question. But I think that's also the problem with having Bernie Sanders be moderated by a Kristen Welker or Lester Holt. I don't think it's any different between those two populist areas. I don't even think you have to be a populist Republican to complain about the media, of course, but I'm actually really curious now that you bring that up, how they handle this issue, because there isn't a lot of contrast between Republicans on it, except for maybe Vivek might have a sort of outside the box. I haven't followed closely how he's handled that question of civilians in Gaza, but actually that's a really good point as to whether he tries to use that as a foreign policy wedge with Nikki Haley, because we've actually seen him go way beyond the typical Republican comfort zone, because he knows that there are a lot of voters that are ready to hear that in previous debates in order to have a big moment with Nikki Haley. So let's see if he does that this time.
And you're not allowed to express sympathy for Palestinian civilians for their own kind of unique dignity and individuality, and the fact that they're a person with a soul on this planet. What you can do, though, and what you'll see a lot of politicians do, is say it's bad because A, it's going to create future terrorists that will produce blowback against us, and B, it tarnishes our good name, our kind of ethical standing in the world, because if the gap between the values that we preach and the values we practice gets too large, then Russia's and China are gonna rush right through that and do barbaric things. You can't condemn our own barbarity, and you can't stand up for the dignity of people just in their own right, but you can maybe kind of do a bank shot.
The Democratic senators we played earlier in the show immediately pivoted to the abstractions of sort of Iran being the puppet master that's also tied in with Putin. And by the way, I think there are serious concerning ties between all of those countries, but it's easy for them to use that to just demand more money under this sort of national security blackmail, which, by the way, they're also doing with Section 702. Maybe we'll cover that next week. But the Biden administration is freaking out about the bipartisan reform efforts that Ron Wyden and Mike Lee are behind on Section 702. They do this all the time with national security issues. They try to scaremonger people into giving more money to Ukraine, to Israel, to 702, to giving up their privacy rights. It's just absurd. It's absurdity theater.
Yeah.
But the media falls for it, to your point.
But I can't wait to watch it. We're not doing a debate special tonight.
Really no need. Again, leading candidates not in it.
Very sorry about that. We just couldn't get it together for that.
You can follow Ryan on Twitter, though, for his stream of consciousness as he absorbs this incredible conversation between Republicans.
Do you know what time it is? Is it 8 o'clock?
It's an 8 p.m. one, yeah.
That's right in the middle of bedtime, so I might have to DVR it and then live tweet the DVR'd version.
Also, by the way, it's co-hosted by Salem News and the Republican Jewish Coalition. So your question about how NBC at a debate co-hosted by the Republican Jewish Coalition, do they give a question to the RJC? Do they ask a question on behalf of the RJC? And then how do they kind of balance that? If they purport to be neutral, which obviously we know is a lie, but if they do, how do they balance that with questions about civilians in Gaza? A great thing to watch for tonight.
We'll watch for it tonight because somebody's got to.
Somebody has to do it, so I guess we will. That does it for us today. I kind of like, Ryan, today we had fewer blocks and we got to spend longer time on them. Maybe too much time in the A and B block, but I liked it. I could have kept going.
Yeah.
For sure. That does it for us on today's edition of Counterpoints. Make sure to subscribe to the premium version of the show. You get the full version, no commercials, full video to your inbox. If you don't subscribe premium, we release about 3 videos a week from Counterpoints. So if you want to see the full video version of the show, make sure to subscribe. Make sure to subscribe to premium, subscribe to the channel. Just appreciate you guys watching.
Breakingpoints.com. That's where you can do all that.
That's
we'll
right.
See you guys soon.
Sounds good.